Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Sylvie Di Blasio and I represent the Work That Reconnects Network. Thank you for joining us for the Webinars and Conversation Cafe series, where we are offering a wide range of rich educational and supportive opportunities for our global community of Work That Reconnects facilitators, members, and friends of the network. Our intention is to strengthen the web of the Work That Reconnects community while continually reaching beyond our current edges to weave deeper connections with others who are contributing to the great turning in diverse and complementary ways. Today, we are going to present a special webinar. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, and in this webinar, we are exploring how system thinking, patterns, deep ecology, and non-dualistic spirituality from the foundation of the two thinkers that we are presenting today, they create also the foundations of what we know as the Work That Reconnects. We will be exploring the intersections among these conceptual frameworks and the practices of the Work That Reconnects that support our activism and resilience building as we face the challenges of today's world. And in this webinar, we are interviewing two amazing people. Fritjof Capra is the lead teacher of the Capra course. He is also the lead teacher of the Systems View Lab. Fritjof is a scientist, author, and an environmental educator who has written and lectured extensively about the philosophical and social implications of modern science. He was a founding director of the Berkeley-based Center of Eco-Literacy and serves on the faculty of the Amana Key Executive Educational Program in Sao Paulo, Brazil. He is a fellow of Schumacher College, an international center for new economics and ecological studies in the UK, and serves on the Council of Earth Charter International. Fritjof is also the author of several international bestsellers, including The Tao of Physics, The Turning Point, and The Web of Life. He is co-author of the multidisciplinary textbook, The Systems View of Life. Now we are going to introduce Jeremy. So Jeremy Lent was described by The Guardian journalist George Monbiot as one of the greatest thinkers of our age. He's an author and a speaker whose work investigates the underlying causes of our civilization's existential crisis and explores pathways towards a life-affirming future. His award-winning book, The Patterning Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning, examines the ways humans have made meaning from the cosmos, from hunter-gatherer times to the present day. His new book, The Web of Meaning, Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Out Our Place in the Universe, offers a solid foundation for an integrated worldview that could lead humanity to a sustainable, flourishing future. He's also the founder of the nonprofit Ecology Institute, and writes topical articles exploring the deeper patterns of political and cultural developments at patterns of meaning. So thank you again to be present today with us, Fritjof and Jeremy. And now I would like to hear from you a little bit about who you are. And, you know, we read the official description of who you are, but I want to see and hear the human description of yourself, who you are, and how you got to system thinking and the work that you do in the world. Thank you.
Well, Fritjof, you want to begin?
Okay. Well, thank you, Sylvia, for hosting this amazing gathering with so many people. And a special hello to Jeremy. I want everybody to know that Jeremy and I have known each other for many years as friends and colleagues, and we also live quite close to each other in Berkeley. and often see each other. So today, again, we meet in our homes, but this time with several hundred people listening in. So that's quite a new experience. Well, as you have heard from Sylvia, I'm a scientist, author, and activist. I was trained as a physicist and spent 20 years doing research in theoretical high energy physics. And from my early student years, I was interested in the philosophical implications of quantum theory and other theories of modern physics. And I published my first book about those issues in 1975. That's The Tao of Physics. And subsequently, I spent more and more time writing and less doing research. And then in the mid-1980s, I moved from physics to the life sciences, to ecology, the theory of living systems, complexity theory, and so on. And during the last 4 decades, I developed a synthesis of an emerging new understanding of life at the forefront of science. And I call this synthesis the systems view of life. This is what my recent books are about, and this is what my online course is about, which is widely known as Capra course. Well, on a more personal note, my values and lifestyle were shaped during the decade of the 1960s. Those were the formative years of my youth. The cultural movements of those years expanded my consciousness, both in the direction of spiritual practice and in the direction of political activism. And while I moved from physics to the life sciences in the 1980s, I also became an environmental educator and activist within the context of the Center for Ecoliteracy, as Sylvia mentioned. I've also been part of various political grassroots movements, beginning with the peace and anti-nuclear movement in the 1980s, which sadly is more needed than ever today.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Fritjof. That's great. And yeah, like I share the feeling. It's always just such a pleasure just to chat with you at any point in time. But to be able to chat with you and share our conversation with others is even more special. So I'm so glad we have this opportunity today. And yeah, for me, well, I was born in the UK, but I was about actually just 21 when I left and came to the States. So I spent most of my life in the States. And the first part of my life was actually spent in a very different place. I actually got an MBA at the University of Chicago, and it was an entrepreneur, essentially started an internet company during that phase of that first .com boom, back in the late 1990s. And I took a company public. But then I went through a total transformation in my life. The company, essentially, I had to leave the company before it was really fully formed, because my wife at the time, who passed away some years back, became very sick. So I left to look after her. The company collapsed. And then over years, even my wife developed cognitive decline as she got sicker. And I felt like everything I'd built in my life around me had kind of crashed. And so I spent a lot of years doing my own search for what was going to come next in my life. And I wanted it to be truly meaningful. And my life became very much involved around this kind of search for what is meaning itself. So I ended up spending years trying to sort of piece things together and wishing there was a book I could have found that could have helped me, and ended up trying to write the books themselves that were my own discovery from this process. So I wrote a book called The Patterning Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning, which got published some years back, which Fritjof actually kindly wrote the foreword for that book. And that book looked at the different ways in which cultures have made sense of the universe all the time, from hunter-gatherer times to the present day. But my own search for meaning led me to realize it was during that time I began to sort of wake up to the catastrophe that our civilization is taking us to right now. And I got to realize that actually it's the ways in which we make sense of the world that lead to what cultures actually do. And so while I was researching that first book, I was also researching the second book that I've wrote just a couple of, that just basically came out last year, called The Web of Meaning, Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe. And this book was really the result of my own uncovering over the years. And I can really thank Fritjof's work significantly for that, because as I was starting off trying to piece things together, where did meaning come from? What are these ideas? How does science relate to spiritual thinking? How do modern ideas relate to the past? Even at the very earliest times, I knew there was this kind of book called The Tao of Physics. And I thought, oh, I should read that. That looks interesting. And then I uncovered some of Fritjof's work, and it was through him and a few other leading thinkers, I got to discover systems thinking as this amazing way of interconnecting our understanding of not just science, but how it intersects with spirituality, how all that leads to recognizing how we could make a different way of making meaning in our lives that could actually lead to a more harmonious path for humanity in the future. So that's what a lot of my writing is about right now, is looking at a real transformation that we need and that's possible for us to actually shift the basis of our worldview, the basis of our culture, for a flourishing future.
Jeremy, maybe we should mention also that we share a very profound interest in Eastern philosophies, and especially in Taoism and Neo-Confucianism. And this is actually how we met, discussing, these Eastern philosophies and the basic concepts.
That's exactly right. Yes. And hopefully in this conversation, we can explore that in a little more depth, and that's something that's near and dear to my heart all the time, is recognizing these splits we make in our culture between different parts of the human experience are basically full splits. And it's through systems thinking we can get to understand how these deep interconnections actually arise.
Thank you. Thank you both for introducing yourself. I think a lot of people, know your work or have heard of you or have your books. And I'm curious about, how did you start with the systems, this thinking about systems and the systems thinking, which is also the foundation of the Work That Reconnects, one of the foundations of the Work That Reconnects. Fritjof, I remember that you mentioned at what time that you met Joanna Macy. That's part of your connection with the Work That Reconnects.
Let me begin a little earlier. I really learned how to think systemically. That means thinking in terms of relationships and of patterns. I learned all this in my work as a physicist, especially in my 10-year collaboration with Jeffrey Chu, who was the physics professor at Berkeley at the time. And at the same time, during the 1960s, I had vivid experiences of being part of a unified whole, experiences in meditation and psychedelic experiences when I experimented with psychedelic drugs, as so many of us did in the 1960s. Well, the older ones among us in the 1960s. And so at that time, I realized that science and spirituality are two different paths to the same experiential truth. And soon after that, I met Joanna Macy. And then later on in the 1990s, Joanna held a small salon, which she called the Systems Salon, in her home, just 2 or 3 people or 3 or 4 people. And I attended those gatherings regularly. We were sort of neighbors at the time. I lived very close to her, also in Berkeley. And so I learned a lot from these gatherings. as I was refining my synthesis of the systems view of life.
Yeah, that's great.
Thank you. And how was for you, Jeremy?
Yeah.
A little
Yeah.
bit, but yeah, if
Well,
you can expand.
Yeah, I'll tell you a funny story about my first encounter with this kind of word, systems thinking, because, I just said before, I discovered Fritjof's work through the Tao of Physics. And then as I was kind of doing further research over the years, I discovered that he'd written these great books in the 80s and 90s, like the Turning Point and the Web of Life. So I wanted to sort of delve deeper into that. And I was reading one of his books. In the middle of it, just fascinated by it all. And I came to a chapter called something like the systems view of the world or something like that. And my heart went, oh no, this sounds so boring. Do I really have to read this chapter? Like, I don't really care so much about systems. And then that chapter basically sort of one of the things that transformed my entire life, because as I started to read it and started to understand, wow, it's amazing, opening up pathways I hadn't thought existed before. So I always thought one of the issues we have in systems thinking is kind of a little bit of like a marketing problem, because the word itself, people who don't know about it, sounds like very abstract or kind of gray or whatever. And of course, it's the opposite of that. It is the most alive, vibrant way of understanding the world and our lived reality that there is. And in fact, I discovered it, and we all sort of, most of us know Joanna, of course, for her great work in creating this way of thinking that this group is part of. What people are not so much aware of is she was actually one of the very first modern thinkers to look at and to write about explicitly this intersection between Buddhism and systems thinking. And she actually wrote, she published a book, I think it was her PhD thesis that she then turned into a book actually called Mutual Causality in Buddhism and General Systems Theory. And she calls it the Dharma of Natural Systems. So that was a very also profound understanding I arose. And then there's other thinkers in other parts of modern science. There's somebody called Stuart Kauffman, who's related to the Santa Fe Institute. And he also writes books like with titles like At Home in the Universe, where he takes these notions of complexity and looks at the bigger picture of these organizing principles of nature that he's uncovered. But what was for me a major light bulb in my life that sort of went off is as I was reading Stuart Kauffman, and he was writing this in one of his books, he was saying, we enter a new world trying to understand these principles that have never been looked at before. At the same time, I was reading traditional Chinese history, and I was discovering that there was this period in China about 1,000 years ago that was integrating a lot of the ideas of Taoism and Confucianism and Buddhism. And they called themselves the Neo-Confucianists. And they had actually developed a whole worldview based on these organizing principles. It seemed like Stuart Kauffman was describing, only they called it the Li was their word. Li basically means in Chinese, like the principles by which the qi, all the energy and matter of the universe, are organized. And that was what led me to realize that actually the traditional ways of understanding the world and the modern systems ways are intersecting and pointing to the same underlying reality. That's really been a big driver of my life since that kind of light bulb went off.
Jeremy, I want to add something to what you said about the term systems. And, scientific technical terms in general can be quite boring to people. And, they are needed if you want to be precise in your expressions. But, my synthesis of the systems view of life does contain a lot of technical terms. But recently, I have found a completely non-technical way of summarizing it. Mm-hmm. And I do so by identifying 4 characteristics of life, which are essential characteristics at all levels of life. So the 4 characteristics are: 1, life organizes itself in networks. Mm-hmm. 2, life is inherently regenerative. 3, life is inherently creative. And 4, life is inherently intelligent.
Mm.
And so you see, those are general terms that everybody understands. And what is more, they're very evocative. So we have living networks that are inherently regenerative, creative, and intelligent.
Love it.
Thank you. Thank you for summarizing that, Fritjof. And I know that you explain much more of that in your Capra course, which is a 12 weeks course. So it's a little bit difficult to summarize everything, but you have done. And people are asking about systems. I also want to continue the connection between the system thinking and the work that we do. So this network, the network of the Work That Reconnects, is a network of people who do certain practices to keep themselves resilient, because it's really difficult to see the challenges in the world and, and stay healthy and sane, with all the things that are happening. So I have a question for you. We talk a lot in the Work That Reconnects about reconnecting to ourselves, to each other, and to the world, and that's part of the work that we do. The question would be why we do need to reconnect. Why when that disconnect happened in the first place. And I know, Jeremy, that you have explored that plenty in your books, and I'm curious about that. When that disconnection started, on why and how we can reconnect again.
That's so crucial. And in fact, as I did this research for that earlier book, The Patterning Instinct, looking at the different ways of meaning making from earliest times, what I discovered is that really our modern worldview is fundamentally a worldview based on separation. And those separations happened in layers over deep history. And some of the first separations are just something that happens to really as a condition of humans, of our conceptual consciousness, that causes us to have a separate sense of self, and leads to the development of technology and language, but also leads to one first separation from the rest of the natural world that all other creatures have. And then going deep history, another step of separation came with agriculture, where we set up fences to separate the wilderness from what we're growing, and fences to separate people who did better than people who didn't do so well, and hierarchies developed. But even then, people were still very connected with the world, even if they had some fear of the spirits outside of their fields, whatever it might be. Another layer of separation actually occurred with the ancient Greeks, when a new conceptualization of the universe arose, when they started to see, and Plato was the one who was most effective in describing this, basically a split cosmos, where the world itself was this kind of polluted place, but there was some dimension of eternal divinity somewhere separate, which is fixed and unchanging. And humans then were seen to have the same separation, with a soul that connected us with that divinity, and the body that the soul was imprisoned in. That thinking, that dualism, was really inherited by Christianity, which then turned that notion of a perfect dimension into the realm of God and heaven, and the soul then became this moral part of our body. And that was then actually inherited by modern scientific thinking. We used to thinking of science as being separate from religion, but the great scientists of the scientific revolution in the 17th century basically were continuing that notion. They saw themselves as doing God's work, and reason as connecting us with divinity. And that's where Descartes got this idea that that famous statement, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Basically saying that the only essence of a human being is their thinking, conceptualizing capacity. And every other part of life doesn't really have an existence. It's more like a machine, whether it's the natural world or even our own bodies. And that's led to this kind of mind this split between mind and body, this split between humans and the rest of nature, this view of all of life as basically a mechanical worldview, and essentially the idea that nature's just there as a resource. It doesn't have its own intrinsic value, but it's just there for us as these unique human beings to exploit. So that's kind of just gives you a potted history of how we built that separation worldview.
Yeah, let me just continue with this, Jeremy. Yeah. The Cartesian mechanistic view of the world, when it was applied to scientific modeling, also included linear thinking. And, you know, I remember when I was a physics student in Vienna, we were taught that, well, there are nonlinear equations that crop up every now and then in physics. But what you do when you meet a nonlinear equation is that you linearize it, which means that you replace it by something which is not the original equation, which can be solved. And so this linear thinking permeated not only science, but economics, politics, and everything else. And when you look at the basic global problems, the fundamental global problems that we have today, which are all interconnected, then you see that the underlying dilemma is this obsession with linear perpetual growth, which is absurd on a finite earth. Unlimited growth on a finite earth is absurd. And yet virtually all our politicians and economists hang on to that. And so this is in stark contrast to nature, to living nature, which is a non-linear network, the web of life that has feedback loops, that organizes itself, balances itself. And our economies and politics are fueled basically by materialism and greed that doesn't seem to recognize any limits. So that's all part of this separation and linear thinking, mechanistic thinking, which now is being replaced by thinking in terms of patterns, in terms of networks. That's what systems thinking is all about, and that's what we urgently need.
Thank you both, and thank you for mentioning, you know, that you know, where that breaking of the natural patterns started, you know, and how we have continued with that. And before we go to the next question, I want to reassure people, because I see that so many questions or comments are coming through the chat. It's almost impossible for me to capture them all because of, you know, the amount of people, the number of people that we have here. We will have a breakout room in about 10 minutes. And we will have about 3 or 4 people in those breakout rooms where you will be able to share with others for about 10 minutes. And then we will come back after that. We will do a break and we will go to questions. So don't worry, you will have the opportunity to express your questions.
I love this breakout room. It's like rolling the dice, you know, and then you are together with people from anywhere.
Yeah, and I understand that you, Fritjof and Jeremy, you may be, you know, joining some of the rooms, right? Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Great. So so going back to the questions, and I had 2 more questions for you before we go to the breakout room. So in the Work That Reconnects, Joanna also talks about 3 stories, you know, 3 stories of our time that I think that actually have been not just in our time, but in any time in history. These 3 stories seems to be happening at the same time. And I actually see that as a representation of how systems work. You know, one of the stories is the business as usual story, you know, is keeping things as they are because they benefited, you know, somebody. The story of the big unraveling is also, you know, a story of, you know, the things breaking down, you know, like wars and, you know, collapse of ecosystems and, you know, other things. There are kind of a natural response when the system is not doing well. And then the story of the great turning, what we call the great turning in the Work That Reconnects, which is the turning into a society that chooses life as the guide, for everything. So looking through systemic lenses, we can see them as the tendency of any system to stay as the same, or what we call resilience of a system, to entropy, which is the big unraveling, and to change or evolve, which is the creativity and the regeneration that Fritjof was talking about. Do you see any relationship between these stories and the work that you do, and how does the activism that you do in the world reflect the concepts that you have studied? So it's kind of two questions in one.
Yeah, well, Sylvia, I would relate this to the phenomenon of emergence, which sort of ties all this together. And to me, this is one of the most important discoveries of complexity theory and of the systems view. We all know that living organisms and all living systems are able to maintain themselves in a state of balance for long times. But every now and then, these systems will encounter a state of imbalance, a point of instability, in the human realm also experienced as crisis. And at that crisis point, or point of instability, the system may either break down, and this is one story, or it may break through to a new state of order. And this spontaneous emergence of new order has been recognized as the basic dynamics of development, of learning, of evolution, and essentially of life's creativity. This is what I referred to when I said before that life is inherently creative. Mm-hmm. And we can learn about the details of these dynamics and act accordingly. In other words, we can maximize the possibility of emergence, we can maximize creativity, and if we do so, we need to reinforce the values that we share, the interconnections that we have. In other words, we need to build and nurture communities. I think that sort of sums it up to maximize life's creativity.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, Fritjof. I so agree with everything you're describing. And yeah, the power of emergence is one of the great miracles of life. And just to add to that is, to me, what I found very, very important is a way of kind of making sense of all this is a model that's known as the adaptive cycle of life, which is a model that's been developed by actual systems thinkers over some decades, and looking a lot at ecologies and how ecologies work. It was actually developed first by looking at forestry, but then it's a model that's been shown to be true for basically any living system, as over any time frame, like for how cells work, for how evolution works over hundreds of millions of years, and for human systems like markets, industries, or even civilizations. So the notion of this adaptive cycle of life, it maps very closely onto the those three stories of the Work That Reconnects. And basically what they show is every living system goes through this cycle, starting with growth. And you can sort of start it wherever you want because it's a cycle, but beginning with growth makes sense. And then the growth levels out to what's known as the conservation phase, which can often last for a very long time, where things get more and more tightly connected and things seem very stable. But over time, that conservation phase, the system can ossify. The network gets too tight, less responsive to change from outside, or the internal connections get overly elaborate. And so in a forest, for example, it's like there might be too much undergrowth develops and too much bush. And then oftentimes very surprisingly, you go into a release phase and the system basically unravels. In a forest, that could be like a forest fire. In a market, that could be like a market crash or something like that. And that could be a terrifying period because things can unravel very quickly. But then it moves back to the fourth element of the cycle, which is renewal. And what's important about the renewal phase is that chance events can have a very big impact. Like you might have seeds blowing into that forest. If they'd blown in while it was in its conservation phase, they would never have taken root because the forest was already so strong. But now forest is kind of burned down. Those new seeds might lead to a very different kind of forest ecology in that next cycle. And that's where a lot of, I think, to me, that's kind of inspirational a lot, because we see our civilization kind of going through this unraveling right now. The question is, can we sow the seeds so that what arises as people begin to question what's going on, as that conservation, those tightly believed ideas begin to unravel, can we sow the seeds for a different kind of meaning making that could lead to a different kind of civilization in the future?
No, thank you, Jeremy. That's part of some of the questions that people were asking. You know, if this phenomena is kind of guided, you know, is not a matter of, you know, how we choose to think. It's something that comes from nature, from the universe where we live. You know, it's this kind of a natural development of systems. And once we understand that, the question would be, again, because you talk about emergence, Fritjof, and you talk about this seeding the seeds, Jeremy. And I know that emergence is something that is beyond us, that we cannot produce an emergence according to what we want. Mm-hmm. So before we go into the breakout rooms, I would like to add the small question of, you know, how do we do that? Is there a way to ride the emergence so we can, I wouldn't say manipulate, because it will be the older pattern of thinking. It would be more ride with it or flow with it, but making sure that what comes on the other side is something life supportive, you know, and choosing life.
Well, Sylvia, I think it's very important that the conceptual level, the level of thinking, whether it's systems thinking or any other kind of thinking, is only part of the story. We also need to talk about values, about meaning, about ethics, and that is sort of the common framework of a culture, a shared meaning, shared values. And things will emerge all the time, but not everything that emerges is viable or useful or beneficial. Just as in nature, in evolution, we have the creativity of life, and then new structures, new order emerges, and then there's natural selection. Not everything that emerges is viable. So in the human realm, we need to have a clear sense of values and of ethics to guide us. I think that is critical. And in fact, Jeremy writes a lot about that too. The whole web of meaning, you could say, is about that.
Yeah, and you have a very nice concept of ethics, Fritjof. I remember that you have mentioned that.
Just ethics as behavior for the common good. Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting that when you look at the evolution of life on Earth, then you can see that nature created communities at all levels of life throughout evolution. From the first cells that evolved 3 billion years ago or more, the bacteria, they formed bacterial colonies, very tightly interlinked networks of bacteria. And ever since then, life has flourished by forming communities. And it so happens that those communities in which the individuals acted for the benefit of the community as a whole were favored by natural selection. And so those are the ones we see around. All the selfish, violent, expansive communities that may have existed over those billions of years have disappeared, eliminated by natural selection. And so in the human realm, we call this behavior ethical. Behavior for the common good is ethical behavior, and that's what we need. And that allows us to speak about ethics without any religion or philosophy and without any complexity, just behavior for the common good.
Thank you, Fritjof. That's
Yeah.
really good and enlightening for particularly for what is happening right now in the world.
Yeah.
So,
And
yeah, Jeremy, go ahead.
Yeah, just to say, there's this great quote by Lynn Margulis, a great systems biologist, and who basically summarized her understanding of the world, saying life did not take over the world by competition, but by networking, just exactly as Fritjof was describing. And I guess one big part of what I do look at in this book, The Web of Meaning, when we're talking about ethics, and when we're talking about the common good, is we got to make sure we're expanding our sense of identity. So when we're talking about the common good, it's the common good of all life. It's because oftentimes people will say, yeah, I'm looking at the common good of my community or the common good of all humanity, which is wonderful and needed. But then there's this other dimension of we need to recognize, and really, I think Albert Schweitzer, the 20th century humanitarian, said it best when he said, I am life that wills to live in the midst of life that wills to live. And to me, that's the basis of ethics. In fact, he said that, like, one cannot but have reverence for life on that basis. And when we start from that basis, we recognize the common good is the common good for all humanity, but on a regenerated earth. That is no zero-sum game. It's not about exploiting nature. It's about working with nature in mutually symbiotic ways, just like life evolved its abundance over billions of years. But that's one of our great challenges for humanity, is to learn how can we be symbiotic with the rest of life on this earth rather than parasitic on it the way we have.
Jeremy, for those in our audience who speak German, I can't refrain from quoting Schweitzer in German, because in German, to live and life is the same word. And so it sounds fantastic. What he said was, ich bin Leben, das Leben will, inmitten von Leben, das Leben will.
Thank
and
you.
I also wanted to mention that you were talking about, expanding our vision to what the Earth Charter calls the community of life. And this gives me an opportunity to mention the Earth Charter, which is a declaration of ethical principles and values that was formulated in about 20 years ago within the United Nations. It originated at the Rio Earth Summit, and it is still a wonderful summary of the kind of earth ethics that we need today.
Yeah. Thank you. Wonderful. So we are approaching the time for the break of room. So apparently Zoom doesn't allow us to create more than 50 breakout rooms. I wasn't aware of that. So there will be more people than we expected, not 3 or 4. There will be between 7 and 8 in some of the rooms. And so it's going to be a little bit longer and it's going to be more chaotic, but we trust that, you will organize yourself as life does, and that you are going to be all respectful of the time and the interventions of each other. I see a lot of, discussions and resources and questions coming through the chat. Again, this is amazing. It's great. And it's so many things coming up. You can save the chat so you can discuss or connect with the people after the webinar. And we will have a follow-up with some of the resources, both from the presenters and from you. So thank you for that. So the question that we are going to explore in the breakout room is, how do you see these systems and patterns that Fritjof and Jeremy have been talking about showing in the work that you do as a change maker? You can also discuss other questions if something else emerges, but we will have 15 minutes. We're going to give 15 minutes because there are more people, so that allows for more or less around 2 to 3 minutes per person, maybe a little bit less depending on the size of your group. I'm going to start the breakout rooms. Jeremy, you want to say something before
Yeah,
that?
yeah. I just wanted to say to people, if you see me suddenly arrive in your breakout room, I really enjoy being able to be like a fly on the wall and just feel into different groups and just hearing what's being said. So feel free to just kind of ignore me if you suddenly see me appear, and I might just appear for a couple of minutes and then go away again. So I hope that that won't disturb anybody.
Thank you.
I really enjoy that.
And Kelsey or me, we're going to be telling you when it's 10 minutes or 5 minutes, so you know that the time is coming. So you will have 15 minutes, and after that, we're going to go into a break. Mm-hmm. So I'm opening the breakout rooms right now. The question again is in the chat. How do you see the systems and patterns that Fritjof and Jeremy talk about showing up in the work that you do as a change maker? And Kelsey is putting that question in the chat. Is that correct, Kelsey? You're adding that question there. So yeah, you did?
Yeah, I already added it.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm opening all the rooms now. So you can just accept from your side. It doesn't allow me, Kelsey. What is going on? Kelsey, maybe because you also have the rooms, can you do that from your side?
Yeah, I can try opening them up.
Yeah, because it's not opening for me.
Yeah, whoever creates it has to open it.
Yeah, I also created, that's the thing. We created both. No. But if yours works, and you may have to put no, doesn't work. Okay.
Only one person can create breakout rooms at a time. So maybe
yeah, I have rooms here that I created. Maybe I will recreate all of them. Okay.
Yeah.
There. So I recreated. It's not responding. It's not allowing me. I'm not sure what to do. Let me just go back again. No? Can you recreate yours, Kelsey, and see what is going on? Yeah, that may be a good idea to take a break now and figure this out. Okay, maybe it's too many rooms and too many people. Okay, so let's do that. Let's take a break first, and then we can come back. Apparently, Zoom is not allowing us to do the breakout rooms. So during the break, we're going to stop the recording. You don't need to leave. You can stay connected. Just, put your image off and just, stretch your legs or, do anything that you need to be safe and healthy. And we will come back in 5 minutes. Okay. So thank you, everybody.
Kelsey, I'm one.
And thank you a lot for all the support and the, to this emergence from Fritjof and Jeremy, and the support from Kathleen and Kelsey, who are going to be harvesting some of the questions in the chat. So before we go to the questions in the chat and to give Kelsey and Kathleen some time to harvest them, we are going to explore some of the questions that came before the webinar. One of the questions was, can you describe, and I think this is for you, Jeremy, what do you mean with, an ecological civilization? Identify the practical pathways that we are leading to, that we need to, to lead to it.
Yeah, and thank you for whoever asked that question. This term ecological civilization is actually not my own phrase, but when I came across it a few years back, it just opened up so much in my sense of inspiration and what's possible, because it captures this notion of one recognizing that we need to transform the very basis of our civilization itself, but that we can do so on terms of the principles of life itself. So we can think of an ecological civilization as a civilization that was actually based on the same principles that have given life this ability to create these rich, diverse ecosystems that are resilient and robust, that can stay robust for hundreds of millions of years. So it's a fundamentally different vision of imagining what it would be like to actually set a civilization that based on not on these values of extraction, exploitation, and wealth-based foundation, but on setting the conditions for flourishing of all human beings on a regenerated earth. And when you start to look at how a civilization might look like, if you thought in that way, you come across certain basic concepts like, for example, mutually beneficial symbiosis, recognizing that the relationship between people or between us and Earth is not zero-sum games, but there's ways to organize things so everybody can benefit, just like you see in ecosystems. And another fundamental concept is known as fractal flourishing. This recognition that just like in an ecosystem, we all live in a holarchy where the principles of that make ourselves within us similar to the principles of our own organism, and we are part of a bigger organism. And the notion of fractal flourishing recognizes that actually for each human to flourish requires a flourishing community, a flourishing nation, a flourishing humanity, and all of Earth. So it sounds so far off from our present civilization, but there are so many different things being done right now that are leading us to that. So that anything that's kind of commons-based, things like transition towns, cooperatives, looking at the idea of universal basic income, agroecology, rewilding. These are looking at establishing a rights of nature, the United Nations. These are all different sort of tendrils, if you will, of that ecological civilization opening up this possibility. But what's crucial is recognizing that what we need is not just incremental change from where we are right now, but we have to use these things as a foundation for a different kind of civilization entirely. Fritjof, I don't know if you'd like
Thank
to.
you, Jeremy. And before you speak, Fritjof, I wanted to say that what Jeremy just mentioned is, all what we call the great turning.
Right.
For that, all the emergence that is happening right now around the world, supporting life.
Exactly.
Fritjof.
I just want to mention that if you want to keep track of all these positive things that are happening, moving us toward an ecological civilization, there's an excellent news channel. It's a website called The Optimist Daily. Daily Optimist or The Optimist Daily. And I look at it every day, and there's some positive news every day, and it's really very rewarding and sustaining to have that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Fritjof. Okay, and there are many other questions emerging. And some of the questions that actually were posted before the webinar were finding the responses in some of the comments that you were saying, Fritjof and Jeremy. I'm not repeating those questions, but there are many questions emerging that are super interesting. I'm trying to go through them. So Kathleen, is there anything that you would like from those questions? I see that you're posting some of them for me.
Yeah, so I wasn't sure how you wanted me to flag them. So one question was, on balance, do you both think or hope that we are in an interregnum that can lead to a transformed, more ethical world for all life, or a breakdown into anarchy and destruction beyond the possibility of regeneration, at least for most societies, although life can survive?
Well, it's really on the cusp, and if we had this webinar just 2 weeks earlier, we would probably have given a different answer. But with the latest events, we have a backlash of a very violent patriarchal culture that we're seeing now in with the behavior of Putin and the aggression in Ukraine. And it would have been difficult for us to believe that this could happen at our time just a few weeks ago, but it is happening. So, you know, the transition to an ecological civilization and to systemic thinking is not a smooth process. I would love to hear Joanna speak about this, but it's not a smooth process. There are, you know, conceptual revolutions, scientific revolutions, but there are also backlashes and pendulum swings. And, you know, in my writing, I have used the metaphor of a chaotic pendulum to describe this process. It's just unpredictable. But as Jeremy said, there are many positive things, not only to keep in mind, but to join and to become active in. You know, one thing I want to mention is these massive youth movements. I don't know whether you have seen the images of Fridays for Future in the last few days, demonstrating for a peaceful and fossil fuel-free society. You know, millions of people all over the world, young people in their 20s demonstrating. So these youth movements have tremendous energy, they have great passion, and they have tremendous organizational skills.
Yeah. I agree, Fritjof. And yeah, and I do want to thank the person who asked that question. It's one of those fundamental questions that we all need to be asking, and that, quite frankly, none of us can have the answer to. Because I think the important thing for me is to recognize that what we're looking at this unraveling of civilization is absolutely, it's a complex system that is going through this phase transition, just like Fritjof was describing before, and just like we see in that adaptive cycle model I was talking about. And in those things, they are inherently impossible to predict because of the nonlinear feedback loops. And there's probably nothing more complex than our entire civilization as it unravels. And that's why there's no way we can actually, we can actually kind of know which direction it's going to go in. And that can lead to some sort of a sense of hope in itself, because no matter how desperate things look, and I tell you, when I look at the ways in which, just this last week, while the Ukraine war was unfolding, the IPCC came out with a report, the most grim report yet, about the fact that we've already passed the point of no return in so many things, and we've got to move so fast. That very report, the fundamental report about the future of humanity on this earth, almost gets ignored because of this destruction of the Ukraine war. And all those things and the continued growth in the destruction that's taking place can lead anybody, and anyone who's looking at these things, to feel into a sense of despair. But a feeling doesn't necessarily relate to anything that is inevitable. And this is the thing in nonlinear systems. What we can do is just recognize that the possibility for that ecological civilization continues to be there. And one thing we
Jeremy, I think just now, in these last few days, the necessity of a fossil fuel-free and nuclear-free future is moving center stage and is getting everybody's attention.
That is so right. And in fact, Rebecca Solnit just wrote a great article in The Guardian today talking about just that. Like just a couple of weeks ago, if people had been suggesting that things like the gas pipeline to Germany would get canceled, some of these like big shifts going on, or that the value of these Russian oil companies would collapse by 95%, people would have said, no way that's going to happen.
Yeah,
the uncertainty is so huge.
Or that somebody would bomb a nuclear plant.
Right, exactly.
Unimaginable.
Exactly.
So there is a very interesting question here that I think that relates to that, and it relates to the work that we do in the Work That Reconnects. So it's for both of you, it says, Fritjof and Jeremy, as you face the realities of our world, how do you avoid falling into despair?
Well, Jeremy, you want to
Yeah.
go first?
Well, so yeah, that's, I mean, thank you for asking it. And that's is kind of where my thinking was going. And because I do feel into a sense of despair at times. I look at the enormity of the suffering that is already taking place. I look at life itself being under such destruction, and knowledge of things like the coral reefs. No matter what happens, are basically going to be dead this century. And this is one of the greatest riches of abundance that life's ever given us, not to mention so many other things. It's very easy to feel that. And I do feel, and Joanna's work, I feel, is so wonderful at this, embracing that, not trying to avoid it, recognizing this only through that touching into the enormity of what's going on with others, crucially, because it's more than any of us can hold by ourselves. But that is what can lead us to transform that energy of that sense of this impending collapse to engagement. Because what we all know when we look at life as a complex system and our civilization as a complex system is that we are engaged with it. What happens in the future is not a spectator sport. It's not something that's happening out there. It's something that we're actually co-creating. I mean, we can think of the future itself as a verb. It's like we are all futuring by what we are doing with each other. So to me, what that leads to is this recognition of not being attached to the outcomes. I don't know if an ecological civilization will ever occur on this earth, but I know there's a possibility. Maybe we are headed towards a collapse and all the devastation that means, but maybe we're not. And what I do know is that the decisions I make, the actions I take every day, are actually creating that possibility of that better future. And that's what we can all share together. Essentially, it's embracing the mystery, diving into it, knowing that what matters is, of course, the outcome matters, but what really matters for us each day is what we're actually doing to work together towards the outcome that we desire so much.
Thank you, Jeremy. And you're talking about something Joanna talks a lot in despair.
Very much along the same lines. In my earlier days in the 1960s, I was inspired by the concept of action without desire, which is given in the Bhagavad Gita, in this famous scene where the warrior Arjuna on the battlefield meets Lord Krishna. More recently, I've been inspired by the great statesman and playwright Václav Havel, who turned this question into a meditation on the nature of hope. And I close our textbook, The Systems View of Life, with that quotation from Havel, and I would like to read it to you. He writes, "The kind of hope that I often think about, I understand above all as a state of mind, not a state of the world. Either we have hope within us or we don't. It is a dimension of the soul, and it's not essentially dependent on some particular observation of the world or estimate of the situation. Hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it turns out."
Wow. Well, thank you for that, Fritjof. That's so connected to what Joanna said. And what we say in the Work That Reconnects, we don't do this work because we know that we have any guarantee. We actually don't have any guarantee that things are going to turn well. We do this work because otherwise it would be kind of a betrayal of the soul. Right. So we do what needs to be done without attachments. I want to say that, there are many interesting comments, but that makes really difficult for us to harvest the questions. So I'm trying my best, to navigate the questions, but Kathleen and Kelsey, if you see any questions that are super interesting, please raise your hand and you ask the questions yourself.
Yeah, there's another one here that I'd like to offer to you. The question is, will it be necessary to give monetary value to all ecological assets as a way to shift to circular economies?
Yeah, this is a fascinating one. Let me just kind of touch on that, because it's this there's this kind of idea going around the world right now, which is this sense of valuing ecosystem services. And it got started actually all the way back in the 70s and 80s by really forward-thinking environmentalists who were going, how do we get if we're dominated by capitalism and by these big corporations, how do we get them to realize they're destroying their own assets? So then we thought, well, why don't we get them to see the value of it? And then maybe they'll factor that into their decision-making. So while it was designed with the best intentions, and it's actually really has taken over thinking in the UN and these big agencies around the world, I am quite concerned about some fundamentals about it. And I describe this in detail in my book, The Web of Meaning, because basically what it does, it's essentially, rather than looking at the intrinsic value of nature, it's essentially surrendering to the capitalist worldview. And it's saying, well, okay, everything needs to have a money value on it in order for it to then be accepted and discussed. But when you do that, all these kinds of actual opposite paradoxes tend to happen. So for example, if you try to put value on a coral reef, saying, look at what it's doing for us, and you get people to agree to that, then what happens when there's the bleaching and the coral reef gets to be sick, then people go, oh, we got to revalue it. It's no longer doing anything good. So now we can build the swanky new resort there and don't worry about destroying that coral reef because it's not valuable anymore. So it's this way in which when we do that, even though it's done with the best of intentions, I think we lose the fundamental that nature has intrinsic value of its own. And what we have to do is shift our thinking away from this financialization of nature and more towards saying we've got to look at intrinsic worth of life, of our own lives, and of our relationship with nature, and move away from any financialization.
Yeah, I agree. And there's a wonderful statement by David Corton that sums it up. If you go to David Corton's website, who is one of the older activists in the anti-globalization movement and so on. And Corton writes, "We will prosper in the pursuit of life, or we will perish in the pursuit of money. The choice is ours."
Yeah, and I just want to add, I think David Corton is here today. Yeah, I see in the chat somebody was recognizing that. So thank you, David, for your amazing contributions to both of our thought, our thinking.
Thank you. Yeah, yeah, Davis is part of the call. So thank you for naming that. I wonder if we can open to questions from you, because it's really, really difficult to see the questions in the chat. So what I would do is we are going to select some people. We still have, around half an hour to go over the questions, but we also want to close with Jeremy and Fritjof adding more to anything that hasn't been mentioned yet. So while you collect your questions, my suggestion is to open the floor for Fritjof and Jeremy. If there's anything that you want to share that hasn't been shared about your work, about the type of thinking that you are sharing with us here, and how people can benefit from that, and how people can make not just it's not just a mental thing, of thinking about systems and how systems work, but how can we actually create change with that in the world. And something that you mentioned, Jeremy, or it was you, Fritjof, that sometimes we're doing all this work, and then something like this war that we have right now, is happening, and suddenly everything seems, worthless. But how we can really go through that and, and use the knowledge that you are sharing, to keep going and to keep building something different. And for those who have questions, my suggestion is to use the reactions and raise your hand. We're going to be taking questions, so I'm going to change a little bit to taking questions because it's really difficult to follow in the chat. Okay, so Fritjof, Jeremy first.
Let me say that it seems with the war in Ukraine that we are sort of reverting to the Cold War of the 1950s. But my prediction is that we are not, because we live in a different world.
Mm-hmm.
And the connectedness and regeneration that has happened in the last few decades will be stronger than the reverting to an old aggressive patriarchal mindset.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, when you look at the world at large and our many problems, then the most striking realization that we have is that these problems are all interconnected and interdependent. They are systemic problems, and they need a systemic approach to be understood and solved. Now, systems thinking means thinking in terms of relationships, in terms of networks. And when you look at our youth, the one thing that is most striking is that they have grown up in a world of networks, with the social media and social networks. So thinking in terms of networks is natural for anybody between 15 and 30 today. And that is systemic thinking. And that is my greatest source of hope today.
Thank you, Fritjof. Jeremy?
Yes. Yeah. Well, I feel in response to the unraveling that we see, in response to something like the Ukraine invasion, and in response to just this continual things like the complete failure, for example, of COP26 to do anything other than reaffirm the power of fossil fuels. Every time I look at this, kind of does come back to this question of how do you work with that sense of despair or whatever again, is this recognition that the darker things seem, the more important it is to shine that light of brightness of what we know is possible. Because one of the things that I find is an interesting analogy, like imagine, for example, that you are in a black room with no light, and there's a screen which is also completely black. All the pixels are out, except for just a few pixels of light. Your whole attention will be to those few pixels of light, because that's where our attention goes. And that's why it feels the darker things get out there, the more important it is for us to double down on the work that we're doing, the work that leads towards a life-affirming civilization, basically. And what we find in something like the Ukraine is, the headlines are all about the destruction. What the headlines don't talk about is to Fritjof's whole point, that we live in a different reality right now. And people all around the world, the amount of goodwill, the amount of love, the amount of reaching out to others and caring as a result of something like this destruction may be a greater force than the destruction itself, but you don't read about that in the headlines every day, which is why things like Yes Magazine or the optimism journal you were talking about, Fritjof, are valuable to remind ourselves of what is actually potentially more real.
Well,
thank you, Jeremy.
A few days ago, there was a news item. I read that the Ukrainians captured Russian soldiers. Mm-hmm. And these Russian soldiers are essentially kids. They're very, very young. And so when they captured them, they phoned their parents to tell them that their kids are okay.
Mm. Yeah.
I mean, brings tears to my eyes, but that shows us that we live in a different world.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mm.
Thank you. So we're going to move to questions from the public. And again, I remind people, this is a call from the Work That Reconnects Network. So let's keep the questions, to that. If you don't know what the Work That Reconnects is, I really invite you to, explore the website and explore the practices. We are around the world, and the Work That Reconnects does exactly what the words say. Try to reconnect with ourselves, each other, and the world, nature. And there are many practices that help us to do that. And one of the foundations of the Work That Reconnects is system thinking. So I invite you to explore a little bit further than that. So we will be taking questions. Gail Minton, I think, is the first person that I see. Go ahead. You can, you should be able to unmute right now and ask the questions, Gail. I have.
There. Thank you for taking my question. I haven't heard either of you speak yet about our indigenous communities. And we live next door to the Taos Pueblo in New Mexico. That and the Acoma Pueblo near Albuquerque have been here for 1,400 years. This is a time when you look to these people, and it's a very, very different culture that we're in. And how do we relinquish some of the things that we are so dependent on? Can we get guidance from these cultures all around the world? I mean, Vandana Shiva has certainly shown us that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for that question. Yeah, any of you?
I agree very much with you, Gail. At the introduction, Sylvia mentioned my work in education with the Center for Ecoliteracy, bringing ecology and systems thinking into public schools. And we worked for many years with Jeanette Armstrong, who is a teacher and a wisdom leader from the Okanagan tribal community in British Columbia. And so our whole system of education was very much influenced by indigenous wisdom. And more recently, you will remember that the whole movement and activism against these pipelines that bring tar sands, or were going to bring tar sands across the United States, was spearheaded by indigenous women in Canada, the organization Idle No More, which then influenced the whole world. So I thank you, Gail, for bringing our attention to this aspect of systemic thinking. The indigenous cultures, many of them are systemic thinkers. There's this famous saying when they talk about nature, they say all my relations. Mm-hmm. Well, if you know something about Darwin's theory of evolution, then you know that this is literally true. Relations are people who have genomes in common, and we have genomes in common with the entire community of life. So they are our relations. So that is ancient indigenous wisdom confirmed by modern science. I think the reason why we didn't get to that was just that some things are always left out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that is all completely true. And that's something, by the way, that I do explore in detail in this book, The Web of Meaning, which is about integrating modern science with traditional wisdom. And something that, just a shout out, I'm sure many people know this book, but Robin Wall Kimmerer wrote this great book, Braiding Sweetgrass, where she does a masterful job of, she is an indigenous person in North America who's also a biologist, and she does a fantastic job of weaving the stories that she grew up in, showing how modern biology actually validates so many of these deep wisdom traditions from native traditions. So yeah, thank you for bringing that into the conversation, Gail.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, and we have Neil Dale. Question?
Yes, actually, Gail, thank you so much for bringing that up. I actually asked a guy named Watercrow at Taos Pueblo a few years ago if he thought the earth was a living being. And he said, well, of course. And I think that the one place that systems thinking is, I've been working against this for years. It's like a concrete bubble. The one place, the one step we don't want to take is to say, yes, she is alive. She's a living being. So I have a question for you, Fritjof, which is, if mind and decision-making are emergent properties of living systems at every level, what kind of decisions do you think the earth or nature herself makes?
Well, we see this all the time. Take the COVID pandemic. The COVID pandemic, like many other viruses like SARS and HIV and other viruses, had its origin in viruses jumping from certain animal species where they lived in symbiosis and did no harm, jumping from those animal species to humans. The reason why they jump to humans is that we have massively intruded in ecosystems, rainforests and other ecosystems, and have decimated those ecosystems and fractured the web of life. And so the COVID pandemic can be seen, and I think must be seen, as Gaia's biological response to ecological imbalance. So that's the cognitive ability, that's the intelligence of the Gaia system as a whole, the living being, which is our planet.
Yes, yeah, that is so right. And what I would add to that in terms of thinking about, right, what sort of decisions does life make, that we need to recognize that we are life. That, part of what our civilization, our modern dominant culture does is separate us from life. So we say, well, we're humans over here, but here there's nature and there's Gaia. And I think really we have to recognize life is speaking within us. And once there was this great poster, actually, I saw in Paris in COP21 years ago, saying, we're not defending nature, we are nature defending itself. And that's a very different reality. Once we realize that actually life is speaking through us, it's a different way of relating, because what we realize is that actually life is calling on us to do what we can for life. Each one of us is part of life's unfolding over billions of years. The one thing we can say about life, and the philosopher of biology, Andreas Weber, says this really well. He talks about the first law of desire of life, which is basically the one thing that life wants is more of life. This is what it's been doing for billions of years of negative entropy. It's taking the entropy of the universe, turning it into this richness of organization. Once we realize that, we see that our civilization right now is destroying that abundance, is destroying that negative entropy. It's a force for entropy. And so each of us can dive into it knowing that we are agents of life itself. And that, I feel, is a very energizing thing to realize.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeremy. So we have a question from Anne Moradian.
Hi. So it's jumping a little bit backwards, but can you explain how this networking of networks has value? Because I see it as a strategic aim. And I'm guessing that it's modeled on something in life. And I'd like to understand what it's modeled on and how you see it or hope it plays out, or where the possibilities are with this.
Yeah, sure. Fritjof, you want to speak? Or?
Go ahead, Jeremy.
Yeah, I think that's actually this kind of profound understanding of recognizing that once we really imbibe this systems view of life, we realize that everything is networks. We ourselves as organisms are networks within networks and within networks. And once we see this, we get to see that the changes that are needed are not going to be coming about through any individual action we take, but through networks actually leading to these self-organized phase transitions of the entire system. And that has implications into our day-to-day life, because one of the things that I feel we need to always focus on is that each of us may have our particular project, that we're devoted to, or that we care about the most. And so we see the network as a way to get those ideas out better into the world. But just as important is to realize that we actually have an equal obligation to amplify the work of others around us, because there's this famous law of networks, which is that the power of a network is a function of as an exponential function of the connectedness of it. So that the more connected it is, it goes up not in a linear way, but an exponential way in terms of its power. However, that's only true when those nodes that are connecting are actually amplifying the energy rather than deadening the energy. So the thing I always urge everyone to do in this, and who's listening, is to look, how can I amplify the work that others around me are doing as much as I'm looking for them to do what I'm doing. And one thing I would just add, by the way, is that in relation to that, recently I've been involved in helping to launch a network itself for deep transformation. It's actually, in fact, I'll just put that in the chat right now. It's a network to encourage people who looking at our civilizational crisis and want to get involved in the deep transformation we need, to actually use a platform to connect with each other. So it's not through some kind of Facebook page where a big corporation is determining what it wants to amplify as a message to maximize dollars, but to actually us as a group to self-organize our own network of networks. So I invite people to join that, because that's how change is actually going to happen, is through the network.
Yeah. I just want to add that this implies a new understanding of power. You know, the traditional meaning of power is domination of others, telling others what to do or forcing them to do certain things. But power in a network is the power of empowerment, empowering others by connecting them to the network.
Yeah, thank you, Fritjof, or how we also call, power with instead of power over.
Yes.
Yeah, an emerging of networks and the hope can be demonstrated to what just happened, as a response to this invasion of Ukraine, all these countries around Ukraine offering suddenly, regular people offering their houses, offering trips, from the boundaries of, Ukraine. So you see that emerging, and I'm not talking about just a dozen, I'm talking about thousands and thousands of people. So that's an emerging of networks that happen without any power over, without any instruction from anywhere. It's just emerging. So I'm going to the next question, and Manon Danker. Manon, you can go ahead with your question.
Oh, thank you. I wrote it down, so I hope to be clear. So I struggle with my humanness, my mind, and my ratio, and I feel that my deepest homecomings in the world come from another awareness in me, kind of like a field of being, and I feel that is strongly connected with a relaxation in my body. So yeah, I was just wondering, so how do you become more in that state of feeling really at home in the world?
Well, I would say meditation is a traditional path that is well tested and very rewarding, and relaxation is certainly part of it. I have practiced Tai Chi for many decades, and it's really an immediate experience of a mind-body connection, of what the Buddhists call mindfulness grounded in the body, together with deep relaxation. So I would say meditation is a very, traditional, very successful pathway.
Yes. And what I would encourage people to look at is this recognition that we all have within ourselves what I call our animate consciousness, our animate intelligence, the same intelligence that is in all of life. And so we can use meditation to connect with that. I also actually follow, I do a lot of Qigong, another traditional Chinese practice, which is has the effect, not instead of meditation at all, but as well as it enables us to really feel our embodied experience, that not that just I am a mind within a body, but that I am truly a body. But just as important as that is connecting with nature, and above all, looking at those deep connections within ourselves that connect with all of life. So then we get to realize how much we are not separate from everything around us, but actually separate to life. So I do feel those practices are crucial as a way to undo this kind of hedonic spiritual anesthesia, if you will, that our dominant worldview puts on us.
Thank you. And you're talking about some of the practices that the Work That Reconnects actually embraces and suggests for people. So thank you for that. So there are questions from Frank Horton. Frank?
Yes, thank you. So you have talked about the kind of civilization we need to move toward, an ecological civilization. And I wonder if you could just name some of the components that you see as critical to that civilization. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. That would be wonderful to do. Yeah, thanks, Frank. Let me start with that. And yeah, I think we have to look at the recognition that we're really looking at different ways of organizing across the board. So one of the most important things to move towards that civilization is to actually put strict limits on the powers of corporations. Right now, the corporations have essentially become dominant over our world. And we can do things right away by saying these corporations are only allowed to have charters and have their charters renewed if they meet what's known as the triple bottom line, which right now is viewed as, oh, well, triple bottom line doesn't work because it's been tried, but corporations don't do it, so it's meaningless. If they were required to meet that, and there were panels chosen by sortition that determined if those corporations even had a charter, if they did meet that bottom line, that's one of these fundamental changes. A universal basic income is a fundamental part, in my view, of an ecological civilization, realizing there's this amazing common wealth of that humans have collectively created over so many hundreds and thousands of years. That's everyone's heritage. It's not the heritage of just a few billionaires who are able to take advantage of that. And in economics, we'd be looking to move towards a circular economy. We'd be looking like at a rights of nature at the embodied at the UN. We'd be looking at changed governance so that rather than nation states being the ones where power was, we'd be looking at basically what's known as subsidiarity, where power is devolved down to the lowest levels of the community where they're felt the most. And at the same time, again, just like nature works as an ecosystem, as small parts being part of something bigger, there'd be a greater power towards global governance, but not where nation states fight against each other to make decisions, but where communities from that subsidiarity standpoint actually get to coalesce based on a commons-based way of organizing. And the commons would be absolutely crucial to that. So that when new enterprises are developed, they're developed in organizations like cooperatives or actual commons-based structures where the ownership is shared by what people actually contribute in their activity rather than the money they put into it. Those are just some of the senses of what it would actually look and feel like.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to go to the last question because of the timing, and then I will invite Fritjof and Jeremy for closing remarks. John Turtz, you have a question?
Yeah, first of all, and I know people do this all the time, but I really mean it today. Just an incredibly, it's probably the best conference I've been to in about 5 to 10 years. So I just really appreciate it.
Yeah.
May have just answered the question, Jeremy, but I was wondering how the two of you I heard your concerns, Jeremy, about the circular economies, and I was wondering how you do visualize, economies in the future. Is it another form of capitalism, or is it a much more major transformation, and how would that fit in with social justice issues as well?
Sure. Well, should I answer that, or Fritjof, did you want
Go
to
ahead.
say anything about that? Well, I do think we have to recognize that capitalism itself has to be moved on from. We can't, so many people have to talk about, benevolent capitalism or generative capitalism, all this kind of stuff.
Conscious capitalism.
Conscious capitalism, you name it. There's
Green
100.
capitalism.
Exactly. We have to recognize capitalism itself is really the system that arose from that same worldview from the 17th century that led to the separation from nature. Capitalism basically, it's no surprise, it came from the same time and the same place, because it's a system of exploitation and extraction, looking at the rest of nature as just a resource for humans to take care of, and looking at other human beings as a resource to exploit. So we have to look at that fundamental. And that doesn't mean that we don't have markets, by the way. There's a very important distinction between those two, because markets have always been part of human activity for millennia. But we need to recognize, that markets are powerful. But Kate Raworth, who wrote this great book, Donut Economics, that I'd recommend everyone to take a look at, makes this point that the fact that markets are powerful doesn't mean that they should take over everything. It means that, just like, say, fire is powerful, but we don't go around saying fire is really effective, so everything should just be burned down. No, we say, no, fire has to be within very tight safeguards. And so the economics of an ecological civilization would allow markets within certain safeguards. It would allow larger state-based enterprises to be there, but it would also focus on the commons and on households, and that's where universal basic income plays a big part, because when people actually are given enough, and there's enough wealth going around that everyone in this earth could be given enough money to actually live in a decent life and have free access to right education, healthcare, etc. And it's just because it's so unequal the way that pie has been divided right now. But when people have that ability, rather than having to sell basically their life's blood in order to just survive the way capitalism makes it, then from that basis, they can choose to put their work that they do into what's meaningful to them, which is why you'd see a lot more work based on households and community-based. And you'd see a lot more energy go to actually community organizations, and where people would actually take spend their time actually building that rich connection, which, to mention about indigenous values that was used earlier, as human beings, we spent 95% of our lives of human history in bands of hunter-gatherers. That kind of community organization is what brings us alive. That's what an ecological civilization would be based on.
Thank you, Jeremy. So we are now approaching to the end of this amazing webinar, and thank you for the patience and for the extra time, Fritjof and Jeremy, because we're going to do the breakout rooms that would have been so nice, to harvest, and to let people to network with each other. So before I'm going to the closing, I'll invite the two of you, to say anything that you think that has been missed and you want to share with all of us.
Well, I want to thank you again, Sylvia and Kathleen and Kelsey, the Work That Reconnects, for hosting this webinar. This was an amazing experience. It showed us that building community on Zoom with 300 participants has its challenges, but it also shows that it can be very successful and rewarding. And in fact, we need to remember that building and nurturing communities is absolutely essential in the world we live in for many reasons. just very briefly, one is that if we want a sustainable future, what is sustained in life is community. It's not the individual, it's community. Community is a basic for ethics, you know, working, behaving for the common good. Community is also essential for what is called transformative learning, learning that doesn't just add information or ideas or knowledge, but learning that changes us as who we are. And that, in my experience, is done most effectively in community. So I wish everybody all the best, and I wish you all to participate in many future learning communities.
Yeah, thanks for that. And yeah, what I would like to end with is maybe just a little story, what actually I touch on towards the end of my book, The Web of Meaning, which has to do a lot about everything that we've been talking about today. And it's a story about a rice pile, which might be a little bit curious. And it's a story about self-organization, because it turns out that these scientists were looking at actually how avalanches occurred. And they wanted to study it by, they basically created a rice pile and they put little grains of rice on to see what would happen. And they were exploring what's called the power law. You have lots of little changes, and then every now and then one really big change, like an earthquake type avalanche, which makes a huge impact. So one day I decided to try that myself, just to see what would happen. Got this rice pile, started to put little bits of rice on it, and saw something similar to what they were describing. But then something else took my attention. This is what I want to kind of share with you. What I noticed is that I put a couple of grains of rice on the top, and at first it seemed like nothing would happen. And then before I did anything else, maybe 20 seconds later, I started to see movements in the rice pile as if the whole pile was alive. You'd see a little bit, something happening here, something happening over there. All of a sudden, a few grains would fall. And what I realized is that when that little grain fell at the top, it was having all of these impacts in that pile that nobody could ever know about. It was just having these small impacts here and there, which caused another piece of rice to happen, which caused finally an avalanche to take place somewhere else. And I got to see, like, if this kind of amazing indirect nonlinear activity happens within these kind of inert grains of rice, how much more is that true for each of us being part of this amazing interconnected system of our global culture and civilization? And to me, that is what ultimately is both a liberation and a responsibility. And the liberation is, I sort of feel like, you know, none of us are going to change the world ourselves. So we don't have to feel the weight on top in terms of our head of like, everything's got to be done. I've got to see the impacts I'm making, because we may not even see those impacts. But the responsibility is that we need to realize that every one of our actions, every conversation we have with other people around us, even if it seems like it's not going to have an impact, has an impact. Everything we do matters. And that's something that I just, with this wonderful group of people who've joined today, to just go back out in the world and recognize that it matters. Each one of us is part of co-creating that future that's possible.
Wow. Really, really encouraging and inspiring words to end this call, Jeremy and Fritjof. Thank you so much. And I'm reading the comments from people, you know, a lot of gratitude that is being expressed for this call and for the wisdom and, you know, the inspiration from the two of you. I also invite people to, you know, follow us in the Work That Reconnects. There are many, many facilitators around the world. So probably you have a facilitator close to you in your country, in your state, in your city. And if you don't, there are many events in the network that you can join. They're online as well as, you know, real in person. And those events will help you to reconnect to others and reconnect to yourself and to nature and to resource yourself in these deep and difficult times. Also, if you want to continue this conversation, I also invite you to explore the courses that Fritjof and Jeremy are offering Fritjof has an amazing 12 weeks course called Capra course that just started, and we still are accepting registrations, but you can also register for the next one if you don't want to join this one. It's an amazing course, an amazing community. It's a real network that, you know, grows in there and continues connecting over the years, not just one course that ends, you know, and people just go away. And Jeremy also has a course, a 10 weeks course that is starting in April. And it's more an exploration, you know, of how we can change inside ourselves and what kind of questions we can explore to actually be that, you know, what Jeremy just said, you know, be that little piece, you know, that little drop that creates the ocean with all the other drops together. So thank you so much, everybody. I want to thank everybody who joined us today. This has been recorded, so those of you who dropped from the call for technical issues or couldn't join us today, you know, our love and our, you know, gratitude goes as well to you, because I know that so many others who registered couldn't be here with us. And also invite you to go to our website, the Work That Reconnects.org. We are going to be sending you a follow-up email with information about Fritjof, about Jeremy's work, and about the Work That Reconnects, and also to access the recording. So thank you so much. I would like you to post a word or something that express how you feel right now. And also you can unmute yourself and just say it, you know, say thank you or whatever you want to say to Fritjof and to Jeremy. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Inspiring.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Very much.
Wonderful. Community.
Bye bye.
Fantastic.
Bye bye. It's so beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.